Fellow conference members, my name is Allan Combs. I'm from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and I'm here with Elizabeth Krasnoff, one of my doctoral students and co-organizer for this conference, or I should say for this panel. The panel is on critical consciousness theory and social justice. Critical consciousness theory is something that comes to us from Ecuador, as a matter of fact, from a post-Marxist theorist, Paulo Freire, who is interested in how people can understand each other better by understanding what's inside of them, or should I say, understanding their consciousness. So we will hear a number of variations on the theme of social justice and consciousness and critical theory coming from a number of presenters in this forum. My own background is in psychology, and I think the thing I want to contribute to this, just as an introductory note, is the importance of understanding each other from the perspective, or psychological perspective, of what's called the theory of mind, or theory of mind, which refers to the idea that we each have a kind of, or if we're normal, I should say, normal intelligence, we each have a kind of theory of what's going on in the other person's head or in the other group's heads. So a theory of mind is the ideas you have about my consciousness or my mind and the ideas I have about yours. So it seems to me that before we can go forward very far in understanding each other in depth, we have to have some kind of working theory of mind. So just as a kind of appetizer for where we're going to go, through these wonderful talks that will be coming along, I want to say a little bit about a theory of mind, or what theory of mind is. Most of you are familiar with it, I'm sure, at least on some level. It turns out, not surprisingly, that children don't have a theory of mind when they're like 1 or 2 years old. They begin to acquire it. They're 3 or 4 or 5 years old. By the time they're 5 years old, they're pretty good at understanding that other people that they engage with have their own ideas and emotions. So they understand something about what their mother is thinking, for example, and likely to do, what kind of emotions she's experiencing, and so on. This sort of basic theory of mind is fundamental to us understanding each other as human beings. And so it tends to develop and become more sophisticated all the way into adulthood and beyond that. If you become a psychotherapist, for example, you may acquire a very sophisticated theory of mind. I'm guessing that Freud had a very sophisticated theory of mind, for example, and understood very well, in his own terms, what other people were thinking and feeling. Now, it's important to understand that everybody doesn't really get this. Psychopaths may have a very limited theory of mind, or they may have an understanding of other people's thoughts, but very little understanding of their emotion. In fact, people that work with theory of mind tend to divide it into 2 halves, emotional half and intellectual half. So we have people out there, some of them in influential positions, I won't say more, who don't seem to have a very good working theory of mind. And also autistic people on the autistic spectrum can, depending on where they're at, really not have much of a theory of mind at all. And, you know, parents of autistic kids and people who work with them find this very difficult to have a child or a young adult or adolescent who really treats other people as objects because they don't seem to have this inner working theory of mind. There are neurological disorders that seem to disable it as well. So a theory of mind, a good working theory of mind, seems to me to be very basic to the idea of trying to achieve social justice. Now, my understanding is that there are certain kinds of things that can get in the way of a theory of mind, even if you have a perfectly good brain. and you were raised by perfectly good parents. For example, if you're dealing with someone who is clearly different than you are, or seems to be, either because of their social background or their racial background, they don't look like you, and people in your family don't look like them, or cultural background, the things they're expecting you to do or the way they're expecting you to act just don't jibe with the way you've learned to do things. So sometimes you have to work overtime to get a good working theory of mind. And we see this playing all over the place, really, in history especially. It's very obvious. If you study World War II, for example, in which Americans saw the Japanese as almost subhuman. In fact, in ecology, ethology, I should say, this is sometimes referred to as extra speciation. We sort of project that these other people aren't in the same species as you, they're not even quite human. And interestingly enough, the Japanese may have felt the same way about us, I don't know. But Americans, while we were fighting the war with the Japanese and the Germans at the same time, never really developed the kind of resentment and alienation towards Germans they did towards the Japanese, because you could empathize with them and you can have a theory of mind about them. So my uncle, who served under General Patton in Germany, said, oh yeah, he had conversations with Germans. He said they weren't high-grade conversations because they were shooting at each other around obstacles. But he never said anything, I could say, nasty about Germans. He respected them a lot, and I think saw them as essentially like himself. But it was very difficult for Americans to do that with the Japanese. So if you think about the problems in the world today and what's going on, or even what's going on in the United States or in our own neighborhoods, and the conflicts, a lot of these conflicts, especially on the street, where people are getting shot at, stuff, often I think really bring this situation into play, where some of the people will say maybe police officers with perfectly good intent are dealing with people that they just don't understand, and they're not really able to generate a good theory of mind, in the sense of saying, oh, this person feels this way or feels that way. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but in terms of working out relationships with other people, understanding who they are and understanding who we are, I think it's really important that we have in play a theory of mind, and that we try to cultivate it and that we use it. Because people don't always use it. People come in for couples for therapy all the time, for example, in which they really do understand each other intellectually pretty darn well. In fact, it's amazing that they can role play each other with perfect accuracy, and yet seem to have no compassion for each other because of their unfortunate situation of conflict. So they've got a theory of mind that works pretty well intellectually, and maybe they have a theory of mind that works emotionally, but they're not using it. And that's the problem with real conflictual situations. When people come together in strong conflict, oftentimes they just put their theory of mind away. They don't care what the other person thinks or feels. They're going to deal with it in a physical or violent or mean way. So this is something that comes into the realm of consciousness studies, and so that's a few comments I have, reflections on it. I hope you enjoy and find our dialogues interesting, or monologues as it might be, but I understand there'll be a space continuing here at the conference in which you can communicate with us and we can dialogue. So I look forward to that. So thank you for coming, and I hope you find our panel interesting and engaging.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Krasnoff, and I am a PhD candidate at the California Institute for Integral Studies in the Transformative Studies program with a concentration in consciousness studies. I'm also the board secretary of the Society for Consciousness Studies, and I am the co-chair of today's panel. So I look forward to bringing to this presentation a close look at critical consciousness theory and at social justice and how the two intersect. Give me a moment here and I will share my screen and share my slides. There we go. Critical Conscious Theory and Social Justice, a panel presentation. Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, defines critical consciousness as the ability to intervene in reality in order to change it. Freire is the main contributor to this critical pedagogy movement, and his work is grounded in post-Marxist critical theory. Critical consciousness is about deep observation. It studies the world, allowing for the perception and exposure of social and political contradictions. But it's not only talk, it is about taking action against the oppressive elements in one's life as soon as one has an awareness of them. I have often heard it said that we are either part of the problem or a part of the solution, and there's not much gray area in between. So this talk is very much about finding ways to be part of the solution reality. Critical consciousness is the core of social justice. It's a heightened awareness of the world and the power structures that shape it. While social justice is the goal of critical consciousness, it's also a process. And the aim of this process is to promote diversity and inclusiveness for a society with equitable distribution of resources, fair access to opportunities, and justice for all persons. The process of reaching social justice is not quick. It is more difficult and complex than that. Nevertheless, it is the progressive assertion that all persons are worthy of the right to full humanity. Freire described critical consciousness as different from critical thinking. Consciousness involves awareness rather than logic. According to Jean Gebser, consciousness is present or being present, and it may also be described as an awareness of another's presence, which causes a relationship or an expansion. First, we become conscious of ourselves, then we become conscious of another, and then we become conscious of the relationship between us. When we become present, this begins developing a reflective, expanded critical awareness of the self, of other people, of the world, and it develops into a commitment to confronting issues of social meaning. We heard from Dr. Allan on the critical importance of the theory of mind, in which one comes to recognize that others are also aware of themselves and their thoughts and beliefs. Social justice would call us to an examination of the structured impediments to human development at their sources. In the forming of this conscious relationship, or this expansion, notions of right and wrong arise. We have to stop and ask ourselves, what are the rules of this expansion? In doing this, we can become forces for social justice by critical reflection on our beliefs and the sources of those beliefs. To that end, we will see a presentation from Stephen Schwartz on the 8 principles that define successful nonviolent change involving consciousness. Critical consciousness involves looking outwards and becoming curious about the perspectives and challenges of others who are often ignored and silenced. By doing so, we purposefully heighten our awareness of how power and equity are arranged and exercised. We listen carefully for the points of view of others, and we explore unexamined individual, institutional, and cultural assumptions. An important concept here to familiarize ourselves with is pluralistic ignorance. In social psychology, pluralistic ignorance means a group publicly accepts a norm because each individual incorrectly assumes that everyone else does, even though they may privately disagree. This is also associated with the innocent bystander effect, in which no one asks to help, assuming that it is an incorrect response. And entire groups of people can be oppressed in this manner with these unchecked assumptions. We'll see a presentation today from Dr. Debbie Flickinger, exploring the question of how does one begin to engage in a dialogue about critical consciousness infused with critical race theory. Critical consciousness raises awareness by creating space for dialogue about how individuals, groups, and systems may unintentionally or intentionally collaborate to nourish social inequities relating to issues such as human rights, women's rights, the Black Lives Matter movement, voting rights, equitable access to healthcare, the refugee crisis, and hunger. In the world of entrepreneurs, this dialogue takes action and makes real change as personal awareness begins to impact multiples of people. Kolles will talk to us about a group of social entrepreneurs who took action and left behind successful conventional work to solve social problems through a market-based approach. In the process, they reactivated their own interconnectedness. While the United States was established on principles of social justice, applying the principles has involved numerous moral and ethical failures, and many would argue that oppression is integral to the cultural DNA of the United States. Promoting social justice in a democracy requires acting as engaged citizens to challenge individual and structural forms of justice and injustice. The experiment of establishing a fair and equitable society for all is ongoing, as we notice inequities, coercion, and violence that is directed disproportionately at certain segments of the society. And we begin to think about how and why these things are accepted and understand that confronting pluralistic ignorance is critical. We are forced to abandon complacency as we feel increasingly challenged to respond to systems-level inequities that affect persons and groups of people with regard to characteristics such as gender orientation, socioeconomic level, race, religion, nationality, and mental health. Mental health issues are also related to social justice. Mental health occupies the intersection of social class, access to resources, gender, and the injustices pertaining to them. And this is all within the context of the oppressive structures that shape individual lives. Alethea Nerad will give us a presentation applying critical consciousness theory, cybernetics, and transdisciplinarity to her work to reveal the deeper causes of systemic malfunction and abuse, the lack of due process rights and redress that cross the boundary of every system. In her words, she asks, can we learn to see and act in higher orders by retelling this story? Critical consciousness supports social justice by fostering the necessary dialogue, collaboration, and in Freire's words, rehumanization of human relationships. Rehumanization of relationships happens through respectful discourse that is democratic in the sense of including all voices. It is participatory and it is collaborative. Rehumanization can bring about needed change when it is paired with action. Plural ignorance can give rise to racism and dehumanization of the targeted person or group and cause mistaken perception of personal deviance as we dehumanize others as being inherently different and less than ourselves. In Steve Taylor's presentation, we will hear that ultimately social justice has to be founded on an increased sense of interconnection and increased empathy, a unity, a oneness. And in this way, he tells us, spiritual development is intimately connected with social justice. And Dr. Taylor is in very good company. This is a quote from Irvin Laszlo here that says, to put it in plain language, we need to change. We can change, and we can change in the right way, because the change we need is to change into what we deep down already are. And paraphrasing from Laszlo's work, it's his recent book, Reconnecting to Source. He says, coherence building in the universe is a subtle process. So his main theory in this book is called the holotropic attractor theory. And this theory says that there's a force in the universe that brings all things to a state of wholeness and coherence. In the contemporary world, he says, it is diverted and dominated by more directly survival-oriented forces and impulses, which tend to be self-centered and competitive, and they polarize the world rather than heal it, which is very much what we're seeing today. Not surprisingly, he says, this incoherence is prevalent in our world, but a deeper look discloses that below the surface of this incoherence, competition, and chaos, coherence building holotropic developments are taking place. They emerge in various domains in society, in the sphere of business, in the economy, in the education, in technological development, in business, and even in politics. But he tells us, fundamentally, we are already connected and whole. We just need to bring this connection and this wholeness to the level of our everyday consciousness. How can we do this? His recommendation is to go back to nature. He says, we have divorced ourselves from the natural world. This has many manifestations and consequences. To begin with, we are no longer aligned with the rhythms and balances of nature. He recommends we go back out into nature, we reconnect with those rhythms, we reconnect with ourself, our source, our spirit, and we regain our wholeness. Once we are in this place of wholeness, we can move forward and use these tools that we spoke about today, 3 social justice tools that you can use to help you take action. Reflect on the stages of conscious awareness. Examine your rules of expansion and engage in critically conscious dialogue with yourself and others, taking action big or small. This is the path to becoming conscious creators, conscious of creating laws of expansion in a socially just and equitable way. Thank you so very much for listening to my presentation and for joining our panel today. Thank you to Stuart Hameroff and Abby and the Center for Consciousness Studies and this wonderful conference where we can come together and discuss these ideas and expand our awareness together. And thank you to Dr. Allan Combs, my professor at CIIS, and the Society for Consciousness Studies, which he founded and which has hosted this panel discussion. And thank you to my panel collaborators. It has been an expanding consciousness building experience, sharing these thoughts with you and developing them together. I'm just going to take a second here and stop sharing the screen. And I wish you all a wonderful conference experience. Enjoy the week.
Welcome to this virtual space and to listening deeply to what I have to offer you. Humankind has been thrown into a new terrain by an unprecedented lack of critical consciousness. In a flash, the world was involved in the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by a sudden recognition of the need for a paradigm shift in the way we approach social justice systems. As I continued to dive into this presentation, I found myself asking questions. The more I looked at each slide, the more I questioned. Who cares about social justice? Who are the future voices? How can they pick up the torch? How can we have a dialogue of the matters at hand? Every day, the people's rights are threatened and are diminished. Social justice and democracy are at stake. With those questions in mind, let's move forward. I have put together an agenda that includes who I am. We will engage in a centering exercise. Together, we'll look at the question that flows through this presentation and includes intersectionality, critical consciousness, and critical race theory. A pedagogy for hope speaks to a call for action. The presentation is summed up with an invitation, references, and my contact information. My name is Debbie Flickinger, an affiliated faculty at Union Institute and University, teaching doctoral courses on social justice, engaging difference, and sustainability through a caring science lens. I received my PhD in philosophy and transformative studies from the California Institute of Integral Studies. I have contributed a chapter in Miracles and Mysteries Witnessed by Nurses, a collection of stories edited by Jean Watson. I have facilitated workshops and participated on panels at various conventions around the globe, most recently in Riga, Latvia. My work is important to me because I want to leave a legacy of collaboration to humankind. It truly takes a village to accomplish things. For me, it's all about community. I believe that if you are open to possibility, change will happen. Before I continue the rest of this presentation, I would like to do a centering exercise. Please put everything down and find the most relaxed position that you can find in your chair. Close your eyes and take a deep breath to release all the stress and the tension that you may feel in your body. Let go of everything and take in another deep breath to feel the energy of Mother Earth running through your body. Now, breathe in peace. Breathe out chaos. Breathe in balance. Breathe out disparity. Breathe in harmony. Breathe out turmoil. Breathe in peace, balance, and harmony. Breathe out anything that is holding you back from the willingness to be fully present. Take time to slowly come back into our space, re-energized and ready to participate. Thank you. Kimberly Crenshaw began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social justice. Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Village remind us that intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing the complexities in the world, in people, and in human experience. Also, people use intersectionality as an analytic tool in many different ways to address a range of issues and social problems. I use intersectionality to teach my students about social justice. Today, I want to emphasize the importance of intersectionality as a connector between critical consciousness and critical race theory. My contribution to the panel is this question: how does one begin to engage in dialogue about critical consciousness infused with critical race theory to hope for a world where social justice is a collaborative process? It is peppered throughout the presentation today. Join me as we explore this question together. Where critical consciousness and critical race theory interject, this video, I want to show a quick, short video looking at racism engaged in our society and the justice system. It explains critical race theory. Critical consciousness is raising one's consciousness to create change. Critical race theory is a radical legal movement that seeks to transform the relationship among race, racism, and power. Where critical consciousness and critical race theory intersect is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called beloved community. Barack Obama recently utilized John Lewis. He is, as much as anyone in our history, brought this country a little bit closer to our highest ideals. John Lewis also believed in a beloved community as he fought all of his life for civil rights for humankind. Everyone is valued in a beloved community. They can live without judgment and have the freedom to vote. A beloved community is free from oppression. A pedagogy for hope. Dr. King's beloved community meets the people where they are and has the power to transform the community into a collaborative power for social justice. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. Bell Hooks considered the voices of both the oppressed and the oppressors in her work with engaged pedagogy and self-accusation. In order to think about social justice in the future, there must be careful consideration of the issues that our society is dealing with today. Communities must have the courage to meet each other where they are in this moment. There must be an element of social justice in that all is taught, in all that is learned, and in all that is done. Dr. King's beloved community is bigger than just your own community. It encompasses the globe. Paulo Freire fought for the oppressed in Brazil, as Dr. King fought for the oppressed in the United States. Currently, I believe that the world is fragmented. But at times we do come together to protest and to work to save the planet. So now we're looking to the voices for the future. The future of the planet depends on the voices of our youth. When the individual voices join together in a call to action and to raise awareness, the intersectionality of critical consciousness and critical race theory become clear. We have Ty Bree, Fa, and John Lewis. We have AOC. We have Emma Gonzalez. And we have Greta Thunberg. Here are some voices for the future who will pick up the baton and carry on. When these voices speak to us, we must listen because they give us hope. As Greta Thunberg stated, we are standing on the crossroads in history. We are failing, but we have not failed. We can fix this. It's up to humankind. This quote leads to an invitation. I invite each of you to engage in dialogue about critical consciousness infused with critical race theory in hopes for a world where social justice is a collaborative process. I've provided some references here. Feel free to contact me with questions at the following address. Thank you for attending this presentation. This panel is grateful for your attendance.
Hello, my name is Camille Kolles, and it's my pleasure to be part of this panel on consciousness and social justice. And I'm pleased to share this conversation with a terrific lineup of fellow speakers. First, a bit of introduction. One could say I'm a cross-trainer in this field of consciousness studies, in that the first half of my work life was dedicated to executive leadership in arts administration and as a musician. Having experienced the power of music to transform and affect social change, I'm now pursuing a wider angle lens on transformation as a PhD candidate at the California Institute of Integral Studies. My current research pertains to how personal meaning connects with social purpose in the lives of a special subset of social entrepreneurs. In the research, I was also interested in exploring interconnectedness at the human level and how, if widely embraced, interconnectedness as an aspect of worldview could be radically transformational. This research, which I'm reporting on today, is very new, and the analysis is just beginning. But because of the research relationship to social justice, I was pleased for the opportunity to jump on board with this panel to share these early ideas. And maybe the findings will actually offer a ray of hope in these challenging times. Now, what would cause someone who has a good life in the conventional sense, meaningful work, a decent income, nice retirement benefits, to lay it all on the line for the cause of justice, to overcome initial personal resistance, to take on great vulnerability in not knowing the shape or form of one's inner vision for change, and to ultimately be terrified, but to do it anyway, in the hopes of addressing a specific form of systemic injustice? What is going on in the consciousness of such a person who would want to overturn their life for as yet unseen rewards? And further, what would inspire such a person to say that, in fact, not doing this would be the worst thing? My research sought to answer these questions through in-depth interviews with social entrepreneurs deemed exemplars of social purpose. Social purpose can be defined very simply as seeking to accomplish something that is larger than oneself and of benefit to others. The evolution of conscious awareness in these research participants is reflective of Paulo Freire's critical consciousness theory. We also see aspects of transformative potential theory, which is a derivative of critical consciousness. In this case, however, the theories relate to the awakening consciousness not within the oppressed, but within social entrepreneurs who came face to face with their own biases and stereotyping as they witnessed systemic injustice in the lives of others. First, let me share the criteria which created a narrow participant pool within the field of social entrepreneurs. The participants are founders of a social enterprise that blends a business model with goals of social benefit. They must be focused on solving systemic structural issues and use pattern-breaking ideas to do so. Importantly, they must in some way have left behind the comfort of conventional work life to devote their work to a social purpose. Further, their enterprise is not affiliated with any religious institution or spiritual-based effort. The uniqueness of this subset of social entrepreneurs should be underscored. These participants were not simply looking for more meaning in their life. For the most part, the participants, ranging in age from 36 to 50, were engaged in major successful careers. They appeared to be using their talents in rather self-actualizing ways before the awareness of systemic injustice witnessed in the lives of others grew to a life-altering degree in them. Before getting into the findings, let me give you an idea of the nature of the participants and their enterprises. I'll briefly highlight two of them. Names have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Meet Katie. In her career as a social worker in a major metropolitan city, Katie saw the same downward spiral too many times in her clients. A person's car breaks down, he can't afford the repairs, misses work, gets fired, can't pay the rent, and soon he is homeless. So at the age of 38, not knowing the difference between a ratchet and a wrench, Katie enrolled in a 2-year program in auto mechanics in a class filled with 18-year-old boys. After she graduated, Katie started a low-cost auto repair service garage in 2013 for all in the state who meet the 150% federal poverty rate. Though Katie has a lot to say about the notion of hero, which I'll touch on later, Katie has been named a CNN hero. Now meet Everett. Everett was named the best chef in a major metropolitan area in the US multiple years in a row. Around that time, he was volunteered by somebody to teach a group of youth in juvenile detention to cook for a food competition. Through this and experiences that followed, Everett was drawn to launch a social enterprise that is a restaurant dedicated to transforming young lives coming out of juvenile detention and to breaking the cycle of violence and crime. The young people work their way through all areas of the restaurant, learning legal employment, social skills, and life skills. These young men and women, who the juvenile justice system has referred to as throwaways, are now employed, tax-paying, wholly contributing members of society. A key emerging theme from the research findings that pertains to our panel topic of consciousness and social justice is this: proximity dismantles biases and stereotypes and can drive life-altering commitment to social purpose. In other words, an up-close encounter with systemic injustice in the life of someone personally known galvanizes one's energy to uproot the system. Now, this does not necessarily represent a new idea, so perhaps in this regard, the research simply provides new evidence of this phenomenon. And it does so in the form of individuals who, while already on a meaningful career trajectory, were stopped in their tracks by these encounters with systemic injustice in the life of another. What is underneath this larger theme from the research findings may be more interesting. What is underneath appears to be levels or progressive patterns of awakening consciousness around systemic injustice. And these patterns appeared in the participants in more or less the same chronological order. Again, these are early days in analysis, so I offer these 4 patterns now as a first look. In this first level of awakened consciousness around systemic injustice, the research participants experienced greater attention to phenomena of systemic injustice within general encounters. And this begins a key part of the process of breaking down their own biases and stereotyping. In the second level or pattern, the general observation of systemic injustice takes on a personal dimension. In the third level or pattern of awakened consciousness around systemic injustice, the participants talk about seeing themselves in the other and report a profound sense that we are all the same. We want the same things. At the fourth level, the participants' evolution of awareness is capped by an ultimate moment of clarity or awareness saturation, dramatically shifting the participants' efforts from that of helping on the sidelines towards a commitment to solving the witnessed injustices at a systemic level. Now let me jump back to these progressions and briefly connect them to Freire's critical consciousness theory. I'll also use Everett's story to illuminate. So again, in the first level, the participants reported greater awareness of systemic injustice through general encounters. As we know, critical consciousness theory emphasizes the importance of reflection and action in an iterative process as one develops critical awareness of one's social reality. Transformative potential theory, influenced by critical consciousness theory, identifies a quality that is called transformative potential. A person with this quality critically reflects on the conditions that change his or her life and actively works with themselves and or others to change problematic conditions. This would appear to characterize these social exemplars. For Everett, the award-winning chef, this transformative process accelerated in 2008 when he first met the 6 young men in juvenile detention who he was to train for a food competition. Everett says, "The moment that I met those 6 young men, I realized immediately that I had stereotyped them before I ever met them. And I was ashamed, because you can live this life and think that you're this good person and that you're unbiased. I was literally confronted with my bias face to face." Everett reported that since that moment, he, quote, "has been unpacking the privilege of what it means to be white, what it means to be male, and what it means to be a white male." In the second pattern or level, as we recall, the participant's general observation of social injustice takes on a personal dimension. Here we note that Freire's critical consciousness involves a heightened awareness of the world and the power structures that shape it. For Everett, this dimension occurred in relationship to a particular 17-year-old from juvenile detention whom he had taught cooking skills for the competition. This 17-year-old wound up winning the competition, which included contestants from the city's major culinary school. This young man was so excited, telling Everett how much he loves to cook and make food and give it to people and put a smile on their face. And when he gets out of detention, he's going to get a job at a restaurant, and he named a fast food chain and another option. Everett thought this was all great and even told the young man, "You should work for whoever hires you first." But when Everett later reflected on this man's story and what had landed him in juvenile detention and the way the systems work, Everett came to the realization that this man is never going to make it to even a fast food restaurant. In the third level or pattern, as we recall, the participants experience a profound sense that we are all the same. We want the same things. If you think about it, having an awakening that we are all the same might actually be considered a privileged point of view. Nevertheless, critical consciousness theory may see this level as having become aware that you are either oppressed or an oppressor, or at least complicit in oppression as a result of your socialization into an oppressive system. A quote from Everett illuminates this third level. He said, "I was reflecting on the 17-year-old me and the 17-year-old him," that is the competition winner from the juvenile detention, "and I'm thinking about the fact that both of our lives were dictated before we were ever born, based on things like the color of our skin and the socioeconomic class we're born into. And that was just kind of it for me. I was beginning to realize what those things were and what they look like. And I was realizing that I didn't want to be part of that. This was obviously a system that I was part of, but I didn't want to participate anymore." At the fourth level, as we recall, the participant's evolution of awareness is capped by an ultimate moment of clarity or awareness saturation. At this point, the participants' personal narratives have been reordered. A moment of awareness, saturation, or clarity seemed to galvanize and focus their energies, driving the decision to become part of a solution. In critical consciousness theory, one could say the participants have taken on a worldview that sees society in terms of systems of power, privilege, dominance, oppression, and marginalization, and have taken up an intention to become an activist against these problematics. Now, as mentioned, I'm also interested in the significance of interconnectedness at the human level. An interesting correlation has shown up in the findings that seems worth looking into. In the participants, there appears to be some kind of relationship between vulnerability on behalf of others and the activation of interconnectedness in terms of sparking others into action to help. In some of their stories, it's as if an invisible web of interconnectedness was turned on, activated, or somehow sparked into action, perhaps by the deeply vulnerable position the participants had taken on in their commitment to their inner vision of solving social injustice. Participant Katie has said this about her own process. "Every single time I said I don't know what I'm doing, there has been somebody who said, 'I do, and I will help you. I may not know how to answer what you need, but I know somebody who does.'" This relationship between vulnerability and interconnectedness appears to have parallels within the academic field of positive psychology on the subject of virtuousness. Virtuousness, such as authentic helping, exercising effective leadership, and striving for social justice, can be motivationally contagious, a much preferred contagion to the one we're all experiencing right now. I'll be curious to see how this correlation holds up as research analysis progresses. Lastly, in navigating these extraordinary times, it feels important to take any opportunity to share skills or ways of being and doing that might be useful. Thanks to the research participants, I'll offer a few ideas gleaned from their stories. 1, develop the ability to switch to another's point of view. 2, invite and deeply listen to the stories of others unlike yourself. 3, dispel the idea of hero. The participants bristle at the idea of hero and seem to concur that to think in terms of hero is actually harmful to the real idea of how work like this actually happens. This too has implications for defining an ethos of interconnectedness at the human level. In closing, His Holiness the Karmapa, one of Buddhism's most important spiritual leaders, says this about empathy and compassion in his 2017 book called Interconnectedness. With empathy, there can remain a certain sense of separation, where the other person is over there, and from where you are, you recognize what they feel or are experiencing. With compassion, you feel as if that distance disappears, and you imagine that you actually are the other person. You might pass someone on the street and feel some empathy, but compassion stops you in your tracks. It draws you in and much more readily translates into action. Thank you. And thanks to the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona and to the Society for Consciousness Studies and founder Leslie Combs for their generosity in hosting this panel presentation.
I'd like to begin this talk with some questions for you to reflect upon. Have you ever had your home taken from you or not been able to secure a place to live? Have you ever been arrested, gone to a food shelf for you or your family? Have you ever had your voice and knowledge suppressed, ignored, degraded, or dismissed? Have you ever traveled to another country where you felt unwelcomed and looked at with suspicion? What story do you tell of your life, your successes, your new job, your new home or new car, the latest papers or books you may have written, politics, your children's successes? What story is it that you tell of your experience, and how has this changed the way you understand the world? As my dear friend and colleague, now deceased, Miller Mayer, said, stories are the womb of personhood. They can make and break us. It's interesting that we've told a long story that, as Charlene Spratneck says, took about 100 years for the mechanistic worldview to spread through nearly every social institution and system of knowledge. But that it's been now more than 100 years since Einstein's first 2 articles established that the universe is best understood as highly relational rather than mechanistic. Our hypermodern societies currently possess only a kindergarten-level understanding of the deeply relational nature of reality. Our current organizational and systemic infrastructure is deeply rooted in a scientific framework that objectively views the world as machine-like and lineal, as Gregory Bateson uses the term to express a sequence of ideas or propositions that do not circle back to a starting point. This has been the nature of our understanding of reality for the past 400 years or more, and applies to how we both view and seek to heal a human being. This perspective has laid the foundation for our societal construct, our language, our organizational structures, including medicine and psychiatry, and is, for the most part, the lens through which modern peoples view the world. Individual and systemic functioning at this level of objective, fragmented, lineal consciousness may suffer a great deal when it comes to the subjectivity, complexity, and ecosystemic nature of the human psyche and the mysteries contained therein. Throughout the span of my life, I have borne witness to the massive protests and riots here in the U.S. and abroad. In the 60s, when the world felt a little unhinged with the assassination of President Kennedy, the war in Vietnam, the Watts riots, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and teachers telling us to get under our desks for air raid practice drills, all of these things etched themselves permanently in my mind and heart. My beloved third grade teacher came to class one morning in tears to tell us that she was leaving and wouldn't be back as her husband had been drafted. We all cried that day, but I never knew what happened till years later when I went to Washington, D.C. and looked in the Vietnam War Memorial book, and tears once again streamed down my face. Even with all those things going on all around me, my young world remained thriving and intact. Later, during my early college years, I stood with professors at UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, where I was doing research on the neurobiology of learning, as we opposed the formation of the Violence Control Center for all that it proposed for human experimentation. I already had serious doubts about what I had been experiencing as I walked the halls of the research facility, hearing the voices of animals being experimented upon. I could not make much sense of it, having spent so much time in nature. What I came to know was that the scientific construct neither accounted for the psyche, the soul, the heart, nor accepted the flow or interconnectedness that I experience as inherent in all things. My mind struggled to adapt to one way of thinking that was taught and reinforced, whereas I felt something distinctly different. This often left me at odds with academia, yet here I am. While I could not at the time wrap all that I had felt and witnessed into one neat little package, my ability to see the connections was rooted deeply in my psyche. Throughout my sojourn in academia, up to and including my master's degree, the banking concept of education, illuminated by Paulo Freire, was the modus operandi of the day, and I believe still is to this day. In order to fit in to any single profession, it was critical for a student to conform to the social norms of that group while forfeiting his or her own unique, authentic, and creative thoughts. Freire writes, the more students work at storing the deposit entrusted to them, the less they develop critical consciousness, which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. Along with this banking concept of education, a paternalistic or parens patriae, or that is, father knows best, social umbrella is enforced. While we have come to believe that we have taken steps forward as a society, when we look at the recent protests and riots occurring here in my home state of Minnesota, which erupted after the detention and murder of George Floyd, along with the protests around the world, the all too familiar stories that once again are being shown and told to us indicate that no true transformation has occurred since the 1960s. For many years, I dwelt in the familiar landscape of being an integral part of society as a teacher, organizational development consultant, consultant for the National Science Foundation and several universities, writer, technical editor, policy maker, volunteer, business owner, healer, and leader in my community. I could say I was one of the privileged, far removed from the traumas of my brothers and sisters elsewhere, holding only some knowledge from my work in the nonprofit world as to the true situation. Truthfully, I had yet to walk in their shoes. I had no firsthand knowledge of police behavior, good or bad. I had no intimate knowledge of the mental health system, even though I had a background in psychology, biology, and neurobiology. I had no firsthand knowledge of courts or the legal world, but always felt that things would work if I ever utilized them. In fact, when I was told of some of the issues that arose when people came into contact with the police, mental health system, or the court, I in many ways did not believe it, as my experience had been substantially different. For the most part, I have been able to dance relatively freely in this culture while holding an alternate epistemology, ontology, and axiology. On occasion in my work life, I had the opportunity to meet fellow travelers who remain rooted in the modern paradigm. This always led to interesting and illuminating conversations as we sought to find common ground, learn, reflect, and potentially transform. We could stay in the dialogue, we could leave. We had the freedom to disagree. It is more than curious that when I found myself in a place I never could have imagined, I discovered that none of the systems I had spent the majority of my life providing consultation for really worked. That dialogue and disagreement led to severe consequences, and that whatever I had to say was transformed into another diagnostic label. I still find it hard to believe after all these years that I had been wrongly and illegally committed to a mental hospital through a judicial process and forced to take psychopharmaceuticals without either having a major mental illness, or any mental illness for that matter, or being a danger to myself or others, which is the two-pronged criteria for civil commitment. I simply never believed this to be a possibility. The notion had been firmly planted in my mind that in order to be civilly committed to a mental ward and forcibly detained, or even to enter into such a process, something must be very, very wrong. This belief proved to be unequivocally mistaken, as was my belief that systems would function properly if I ever really used them, and that truth and justice would prevail. The modern paradigm does little to make room for the other, and in the psychiatric lexicon can deem it as an aspect of mental illness, creating a great divide by delineating linearity as normalcy and contextual thinking as tangential and abnormal. An ecological, ecosystemic, or cybernetic view does not see an alternate epistemology as oppositional, but as part of a greater whole. My beliefs and my whole world were turned upside down with all that I experienced as I came face to face with opposing constructs and beliefs, and with deeply abusive individual and systemic dysfunction imbued with the profound power to alter reality. The ideas of knowledge construction and how what we believe determines how we act have given me pause. What I experienced and witnessed in the civil commitment process made me wonder how we have survived as a human race. Though the cracks have been evident in the foundation of Western epistemology for some time, recent events have made those cracks far more visible to a broader range of people. Yet, the voices of those enduring commitment, loss of financial resources and homes, and systemic and racial abuse still go relatively unheard, and little transformation occurs. My sojourn inside the system made it abundantly clear the deeper reasons for the ongoing upheaval seen in the various forms of protesting, riots, and civil disobedience. The ongoing protests against the system, numbering in the thousands, large and small, on various aspects of our current modus operandi, essentially show us the fight against modernity. Humanity is evolving, yet all of our systemic structures, including education, lag immeasurably behind. The web is densely woven that enables a depth of social injustice to be perpetuated. It is a huge cost to our society, lessens our humanity, and puts us at deep odds with each other. Can we disentangle the web? And more importantly, are we willing to disentangle the web? Since there are many layers to this, I do not have the time to go deeply into the built-in aspects of systemic structures, but will highlight them, a few of them, as pointers to what needs review and change in order to bring our systemic structures into deeper alignment with an ever-evolving humanity and planetary ecology. One of the key issues is this notion of qualified immunity, which relates in essence to a lack of personal responsibility. We have self-regulating systems. Lawyers, judges, police, doctors all create their rules, their own rules of professional responsibility. Parens patriae, father knows best. They can override personal agency and autonomy. the notion of positional power in the system. It's a monologue that provides opportunity for falsification of information in reports and documents. The system itself is not structured to self-correct. There's a deep lack of oversight. Even when bodies are created that appear to have oversight, they have no enforcement capability. The Attorney General of each state protects all government workers and those working within the system. There's an unlimited power to spend money, stall, and obfuscate. And lastly, but certainly not least, even with laws in place to ensure rights, civil rights, it is often the very same people holding you and making money on you that must also ensure that you have rights. A new storytelling needs to emerge as our 400-plus-year-old story and those acting out the embedded behaviors from years of our banking education of that very story is wearing thin and no longer serves the conscious growth of humanity or the planetary ecology. But it still serves power from its place of oppression, immunity, and domination. As consciousness scholars and researchers, how might we take our reflections, our true reflections, and turn our thoughts into action and a deeper dialogue filled with love, such that the way we teach changes our systemic structures, such that they may represent all people and provide true justice without oppression and domination? If we speak of consciousness, how does all this talk transform the world we are living in today? Are we using our awareness to awaken, stir the souls, the psyche of our fellow travelers, to enliven dialogue filled with love and hope so we may transform our systems and society? It is a somewhat arduous path, for we will need to move from our comfort zones, out of systems that bind our creativity and lessen our critical consciousness. What do we need to teach, be, and do in order to truly transform?
Hi, my name is Steve Taylor. I'm a researcher and lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. I'm also the chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Psychological Society. And today I'm going to give you a presentation on, let me share with you the title of my presentation, if I can find it. Here it is. I'm going to give you a presentation which looks into fundamental oneness and social justice, separateness versus connection. So I'm going to look into the connection or the link between human beings' sense of separation and the injustice and cruelty which we know that human beings are capable of. And I'm going to look into, conversely, the link between a sense of connection and a sense of justice and altruism and compassion. And later on, I'm going to link this to my own philosophical approach, which I call panspiritism. Panspiritism suggests that human consciousness is the influx or the manifestation of a more fundamental universal consciousness which exists beyond the brain. And I'm going to discuss whether separateness is fundamental to the human condition or whether connection is fundamental. I'm going to question whether separateness or connection are ontologically fundamental to the human condition. So I'd like to begin by sharing with you a letter. This is a letter which was written in July 1939 by Mahatma Gandhi to Adolf Hitler. So Gandhi wrote this letter at a time when it seemed clear that the human race was heading towards a new war, the Second World War. And Gandhi wrote to Hitler to beg him to desist from his aggressive actions. So this is what Gandhi wrote to Hitler. He said, "It is quite clear that you are today the one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to the savage state. Will you listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war, not without considerable success? Anyway, I anticipate your forgiveness if I have erred in writing to you. I remain your sincere friend, Mahatma Gandhi." So nobody knows whether Hitler received this letter or whether he read it. But obviously, it had no effect as Hitler invaded Poland a couple of months later and the Second World War began. Gandhi had actually met Mussolini a few years previously. So it could be that Gandhi hoped that Hitler was aware of his. Here's actually a photo of Gandhi and Mussolini. I think this is from 1931. And Mussolini was an admirer of Gandhi because of Gandhi's opposition to the British Empire. So maybe Gandhi was thinking that Hitler also admired him. And he was maybe thinking that he would be able to influence Hitler. But obviously, this was not the case. He actually wrote to Hitler again a year into the Second World War, begging him to stop the war. But obviously, it was impossible to reason with somebody like Hitler. It was impossible to appeal to the sense of humanity of somebody like Hitler who had no sense of humanity. But I think this interaction between Gandhi and Hitler is quite interesting because Gandhi and Hitler represent two opposing extremes of human nature. Gandhi was not a perfect human being, but he represented an ideal of compassion and altruism and self-sacrifice. Gandhi represented an ideal of connection, somebody who lived by universal principles of morality and justice which transcended his own well-being, his own individual existence. Whereas obviously Hitler was the opposite. Hitler was a psychopathic, paranoid person who had no sense of empathy, no sense of connection, no sense of emotion. To him, all of the human beings were objects, and they only had value in as much as they could help him to achieve his aims. So Hitler was somebody who was completely disconnected from other human beings, existing in an extreme sense of separation. Whereas Gandhi was somebody who existed in an intense sense of connection. He obviously felt a very strong sense of connection to other human beings. So what I would like to suggest is that human goodness, as represented by the ideal of Gandhi, is linked to a sense of connection. And this sense of connection gives rise to empathy, first of all, and empathy gives rise to altruism. And this sense of connection also brings the ability to take other people's perspectives. And the ability to take people's perspectives gives rise to justice and a sense of the rights of other people, a sense of the equality of other people. And conversely, a sense of disconnection and separation, as represented by Hitler, gives rise to cruelty and injustice. And this is largely to do with a lack of empathy. If you exist in a sense of separation, as Hitler did, then you have no empathy for other people. You have no ability to take other people's perspectives. And this means that you have no sense of justice with regard to other people. You have no sense of the rights of other people. You have no sense of the equality of other people. And without a sense of empathy, you are able to commit acts of brutality and cruelty. You have no sense of the suffering that you cause other people. There's no reason for why you should stop inflicting pain on other people. There's nothing to stop you exploiting and oppressing other people, because other people are just objects to you. Nothing matters apart from your own desires and goals. And if other people are obstacles to your desires and goals, then there's no reason why you can't exploit them and even eliminate them. Other people's rights are immaterial. Morality is immaterial. So you can see an extreme version of this in people with personality disorders, like Hitler. Hitler was obviously a very disordered personality. And people with personality disorders such as psychopathy and malignant narcissism, they represent an extreme sense of separation. They represent the furthest extreme of human ego isolation and ego separation. And unfortunately, in our world, it's not uncommon for governments to consist of these people with an extreme sense of separation. People with personality disorders feel very impelled towards positions of power. They often take positions of power in our societies. And there's a very interesting concept developed by the Polish psychologist Andrew Lobachevsky. He developed the concept of pathocracy, which is when governments consist of people with personality disorders. And this is obviously very, very relevant in the world at the moment, particularly in the US, where arguably the government consists of people with personality disorders and people with an extreme lack of empathy and justice. So this, you could call this the hyper-individuated sense of self. This hyper-individuated sense of self is the root cause of all forms of human brutality, from individual acts of cruelty to collective acts of brutality, such as warfare and the oppression of different groups, different classes, and different castes. On the other hand, the human sense of connection is the root of human goodness. So people with a labial sense of self, which enables a sense of compassion and a sense of empathy and gives rise to altruism. These people are able to sense other people's suffering. They're able to sense other people's joy as well. They're able to take other people's perspectives. And so they're reluctant to act in any way which causes suffering to others. On the contrary, they feel a strong impulse to alleviate other people's suffering. So let me now link this to my own perspectives, my own philosophical perspective. But the question I'd like to ask first is whether separateness is fundamental to human nature or whether connection is fundamental to human nature. Does one state have ontological primacy over the other? In our culture, there tends to be an assumption of fundamental separateness. You know, this comes from the idea that consciousness is produced by the brain, which is taken for granted by a lot of people. If consciousness is produced by our brains, then we exist within our own brain-generated mental space, and we are inside our bodies, and we are fundamentally disconnected from one another. And also from the point of view of the notion of the selfish gene, the notion that human beings are biological machines full of selfish genes which have an impulse to replicate and to survive, then obviously that posits a fundamental separateness too. I think this notion of fundamental separateness has had a terrible effect. You know, it's kind of underpinned the capitalist systems of the late 20th century, the early 21st century. It's kind of justified selfishness and individuality and competitiveness within our societies, and to the detriment of many people. Human traits such as altruism and cooperation have been severely underplayed within our societies. And then a lot of this came from the book The Selfish Gene, which, in some ways justified the hyper-individualism and competitiveness of our societies. But it's also possible that connection is more fundamental than separateness. It's possible that separateness is superficial and even aberrational. We all feel separate from time to time. We all feel a sense of separateness to some degree. But it's possible that this sense of separateness is only on the surface. It's possible that at a deeper level, we are actually interconnected. And this is where I'd like to bring in my own philosophical approach, which I call panspiritism. And the basic idea of panspiritism is that consciousness is a universal and fundamental quality. In panpsychism, consciousness is inherent in particles of matter, or it's associated with particles of matter. But in panspiritism, it goes beyond that. Consciousness is not just in matter, it's in all space too. And all material things are actually a manifestation of consciousness. Fundamental consciousness expresses itself in terms of matter. Matter arises from fundamental consciousness. And I have adopted the transmission hypothesis that was originally put forward by William James in 1897. William James compared the brain to a prism or refracting lens, which transmits a white light or indivisible radiance. And the function of the brain, according to my approach, is not to produce consciousness, but to mediate consciousness. The brain acts as a receiver of consciousness. And so fundamental consciousness is canalized into our own individual being via the brain. So from this point of view, we are all interconnected. We all share the same fundamental consciousness. We're all expressions of the same fundamental consciousness. And I think this offers the best way of explaining altruism. Altruism is problematic. You know, if you assume that human beings are fundamentally separate, that we consist of selfish genes, then altruism is problematic. I mean, there are obviously many neo-Darwinian attempts to explain altruism. I don't have time to go into them here. If you'd like to read further, I suggest reading my paper, The Puzzle of Altruism, that was published last year in Explore, the journal Explore. But no neo-Darwinian explanation of altruism is really adequate. They are all problematic. But if we assume that human consciousness is the expression of a more fundamental consciousness, and that we all share the same essential consciousness, then altruism becomes easier to explain, because we do have the ability to sense other people's suffering. We have the empathic ability to sense other people's experiences. So if you suffer, then I can sense your suffering, and I feel the impulse to act in order to alleviate your suffering. That is the altruistic impulse. So altruism is possible because we have the empathic ability to sense other people's suffering, and this ability arises from our shared essential consciousness. And there's a great quote from the Spanish mystic Cordovero I'd just like to bring in here. Cordovero said, in everyone there is something of his fellow man. Therefore, whoever sins injures not only himself, but also that part of himself which belongs to another. In this way, it is important to love others, because the other is really oneself. So from my point of view, transcending cruelty and injustice is about transcending separateness. It's about increasing and strengthening our sense of connection. And I think this is the essential aim of spirituality. All of the world's spiritual traditions speak about transcending separateness and recovering or sensing a fundamental oneness. All spiritual traditions suggest that suffering is caused by our sense of separateness, and they all suggest paths and strategies of transcending separateness. So in this way, spirituality and social justice are deeply interconnected. As we become more spiritually developed, we transcend separateness. We experience more empathic connection towards other human beings, and we become more altruistic. So essentially, there is no separation between spiritual development and social development. Spiritual development brings more justice, more empathy, more altruism, and it enables us to experience our fundamental connection and our fundamental oneness. I'd just like to end this presentation by reading a short poem. This is one of my poems. I'm also a poet. And I think this poem maybe expresses the point of view I'm trying to discuss here. Maybe it expresses it better than I can in terms of my normal prosaic words. So this is called We Are Each Other. We're not ghostly entities marooned inside our mental space with our personal pain and suffering that can never be shared or understood. We're not machines full of selfish genes. We're always scheming to outdo each other and only ever show kindness if there's some benefit to ourselves. We are each other. Every human being's feelings flow like currents of air through the atmosphere of our communal being, brushing each other's souls, touching each other's hearts, stirring mutual compassion. We feel compassion because we're connected. We sense each other's suffering because we share each other's being. We risk our lives for each other because there is only one life. We help and heal and love each other because we are each other. So thank you very much. If you'd like to find out more about my work, here's my website and my personal email address. My website is stephenmtaylor.com. I'll just add in the .com there. My address is here, s.m.taylor@leedsbeckett.ac.uk. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. All the best.
Giving up on hate.
4 times in my life I've been involved in massive social transformation. In the 50s and 60s it was the civil rights movement, and I think my job was mostly to get arrested. I've seen the inside of a lot of southern drunk tanks and slept in a lot of choir lofts in black churches. In the 70s, it was the transformation of the American military from the elitist conscription organization of the Vietnam era to the all-volunteer meritocracy we have today. In the 80s and 90s, it was what came to be known as citizen diplomacy. A group of us working through the Allan Institute began trying to set up back channels to keep the Soviet Union and the United States from blowing each other up. And I can remember very clearly as I came down on Christmas morning and after Christmas breakfast checked my email, and there was an email from a close friend who was on the staff of Mikhail Gorbachev, and it said, "The Soviet Union is no more." And it made me realize how ephemeral change of things which we think of being fixed actually is. And it set me in motion for what is now almost 2 decades of research about how social transformation can happen and how individuals like us can make it happen. And that's what I want to focus on today, because I think many of you would agree we are a nation that is in crisis with all kinds of threats and changes that are coming that are creating difficulties and stress. You talk about it with your neighbors, you hear it at parties, you talk about it at sports events. How can we create change? Well, I can tell you from doing now almost 2 decades of research, over 2 decades of research, that change comes in 2 forms. It's violent, coercive, or it is nonviolent. Now, the interesting thing is that violent change, actually, we now know from scientific research, doesn't last very long. If you think about it for a moment, the Soviet Union just lasted a little over 70 years, less than a single person's lifetime. Nazi National Socialism in Germany lasted, depending on how you calculate it, either 10 or 20 years. So even things which seem incredibly fixed and powerful can be altered, and they can be altered by ordinary people. And I want to share with you what I have learned in the research that I have done about how that happens. And it comes in 2 stages. First is the individual, and then is the social. The individual begins with something so simple you can hardly believe that it could actually make a difference. It is the quotidian choice. Quotidian means daily, mundane, ordinary. And these choices are the kind of thing we do when we go into the store. We buy a particular kind of toothpaste or a cat food or a roll of toilet paper. And do we really think, what is the nature of the company that is producing this? Are we conscious of what we're really buying? Because buying is a kind of voting. If we are unconscious, and most people are, they don't even realize they're making choices. So first of all, we need to become aware that we are making choices. And second of all, we must commit of the options that are available to us to always choose the one that is most compassionate and life-affirming. Now, none of them may be great choices, but inevitably one choice is always slightly better than the one than the others. It is more life-affirming, it is more compassionate, it is more productive of wellness. Because as we look at these changes that are facing us, and we can see them in climate change, in the fact that we will become a majority-minority country, that we are a post-middle class society. 45 million people are in poverty. We have 17 million children with hunger issues. What kind of world do we want to change into? This change is going to happen. Is it a dystopian world, or is it a world that is oriented toward wellness? And I want to suggest to you that the change toward wellness, and that's what I favor. I don't know about you, but I find most of these dystopian movies very dreary. I don't want to live there. I want to live in a place where people feel good and happy and prosperous and healthy. I want wellness, and I mean by wellness just what you think I mean. So quotidian choices are where the individual begins. And if you don't think this actually can make a difference, look at, just to give you one example, about 18 months ago, there was a decision that was arrived at by thousands and thousands and millions of little choices, and that was to choose LGBT over gay. Nobody passed a law, the president didn't go on television, but people just made a decision. Yes, I will do this, I will say this. It's not just a change in term, it's a change in concept about what it means to be a human being. So quotidian choice is how we begin. If you, the people in this room and the people that see this video, will make the commitment, I will commit that first of all, I will become aware of the implications of the choices that I am making, and that of the choices available to me, I will consistently choose that option which is the most compassionate and life-affirming and productive of wellness. I can tell you that the people in this room and those that hear this can change the course of history. Now, once we move past the individual to the group, I began studying how do groups become successful? Why do some social movements do better than others? Why do they become better? And what emerged out of that was 8 laws. I didn't invent these laws. They are simply patterns that successful transitional organizations which are socially compassionate worked out for themselves. But here they are, and when you start a group or you join a group or you become involved in something, if you will help nurture these 8 laws, your group statistically will become more successful than it would otherwise be. So here they are. The first one, become aware you're making a choice. Choose the compassionate and life-affirming option as you understand it in the moment, and that the individuals in the group and the group collectively must share a common intention. Now, if you've ever been part of a group, you know that getting common intention is not easy. Law number 2, the individuals in the group may have goals, but they may not have cherished outcomes. That is, you don't know what's going to happen. When I was reading the diaries and correspondence of abolitionists, they would say, I want to end slavery. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it must end. It is a moral evil. Law number 3, the individuals in the group must accept that their goal may not be reached within their lifetimes and be okay with this. That's something else I learned from the abolitionists. They didn't know that it was going to happen, but they were committed to its happening. Law number 4, the individuals in the group must accept they may not get either credit or acknowledgement for what they've done and be okay with that. Now, you know how hard it is when you don't feel like you got recognized. But if the thing that you are serving is productive of wellness, That is the goal, and you can do it, and you will ultimately reap the benefit. Law number 5. Each person in the group, regardless of gender, religion, race, or culture, must enjoy fundamental equality, even as the various roles in the hierarchy of the effort are respected. We are all fundamentally equal, and if you hold a higher position in any particular organization, that does not make you a superior being. Law number 6, the individuals in the group must forswear violence in word, act, or thought. I confess, for me, this is the hard one. Because when I see somebody do something hurtful to another, I cannot always tell you that I have peaceful thoughts. Law number 7, the individual in the group must make their private selves consistent with their public posture. I do a daily web publication called Schwartz Report, and so I read about 80 journals and newspapers every day. And almost every day, it's just as regular as clockwork. There's somebody who has set themselves up as a moral authority, as the teacher, as the arbiter of what proper behavior is. That's their public self. They talk about it all the time. And yet in the back room, behind the curtain, all sorts of very unpleasant things happen. Law number 8, the individual in the group and the group collectively must always act from the beingness of life-affirming integrity. We are at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads as a culture, we're at a crossroads as a country, we're at a crossroads as a world. You can look at the scientific research and see that this change is coming. The question that I leave you with is, are you prepared to stand up? To stand up and say, I will be an agent of change that produces wellness. Wellness as I understand it in this moment. I may understand it differently a year from now, but at this moment, day by day, minute by minute, I will serve the creation of wellness so that my children and my grandchildren, I have 2 grandsons, will live in a world that has wellness as a social priority. Thank you.